Here is a very brief recording that contains your week 2 critical vocabulary. Every week, I will share some terminology that you should begin integrating into your writing of your discussion posts and your reading reflections to help exemplify that you are learning and comprehending and analyzing the course content in deep ways. These critical vocabulary words will show up on your quizzes, both quiz 1, quiz 2, and on the final quiz. And the definitions are found in these short vocabulary presentations that I'll provide to you. So it is very important that you pay attention and that you watch these short videos.
The first definition this week is perhaps one of the most important concepts that we will ever explore in this course, which is the definition of race. Now, many of us think of the term of race and say, I know what race means. It's who you are. Are you Black? Are you African American? Are you African? Are you Asian? Are you Native American? Are you Latino? Are you Indian? Yeah, those are races, right? But it is much more complex than that. Please read along with me. Race refers to the categories into which society places individuals on the basis of physical characteristics such as skin color, hair type, facial form, etc. Though many believe that race is determined by biology, it is now widely accepted that this classification system was in fact created for social and political reasons. I'll repeat this. Race is not determined by biology. It is inaccurate. There is only one race, which is the human race. And certainly there are variations of ethnicity within the human race. But we are only one race. This classification system was developed to put white Europeans at the top and people with darker skin at the bottom of social stratification. So there is no accuracy genetically or biologically to the concept of race. It is a system that places some at an advantage and others at a disadvantage. And it is a system that has justified colonization, genocide, racism, slavery, etc. for centuries. If we look at the bottom paragraph, it says there's actually more genetic and biological differences within a quote unquote racial group than among quote unquote different races. So I implore you to reprogram your mind at this point. Begin the processes of deprogramming what has been instituted and indoctrinated into us as human beings, that we are different races. We are only one race. We are the human race. And certainly we have different ethnicities. But I would encourage you to even stop using the categories of race if possible. If you look at this picture, you can see how the early eugenicists, or people who promoted that Europeans were the one true pure race, would use things such as the human skulls to dictate a stratification of who was more intelligent or who was more civilized. And it's a fascinating history to explore, the history of eugenics and the development of the concepts of race. But while racism is a false construct, racism is certainly real. So that presents a very complex reality that we have to grapple with, and we will explore much more about that in the future. Let's define racialization, or the processes through which people began to be designated as one particular race over another. As you can see in this picture, you see the principal varieties of mankind, right? In which, who's front and center? The white European male, which is deemed as the ideal standard for the different races. And then you see all of the different quote unquote racial varieties that are circulating around him. Again, we are going back to the understanding that race is not a biological, accurately correct concept. It was created. And therefore, the dividing of men and women on the earth into categories of race was a process that was carried out by European men for their own advantage. So, racialization is the process through which different groups were designated whatever quote unquote race Europeans decided they were. It is the process of manufacturing and utilizing the notion of race in any capacity, through which groups come to be socially constructed as races based on ethnicity, language, economics, religion, culture, politics, etc. Here's another example of an image depicting the types of the races of man. And who's at the top? Of course, the Caucasian white men, or people who have lighter skin are placed at the top. And then who are the people at the bottom? People of Africa, of Australia, of Native America, people with dark skin at the bottom. And people in the middle, probably, of Middle Eastern or Arab or Malaysia, as they claim in this image. This is more proof that racialization was a process that took place in order to stratify the different variations of mankind and to justify who should be at the top and who should be at the bottom. Now that we have a firm foundation of the understandings of the fallacy, the inaccuracy of race, and the development of racialization, we can expand into the definition of ethnocentrism, or if we break it down, the centering of one's ethnic group as the ideal standard. Ethnocentrism is the tendency to view others through the filters and assumptions of one's own group and practices, and to see one's own group as the norm, the best, or the ideal to which others should conform. So, living in the United States of America and in the world, as a matter of fact, to a larger extent, we see Eurocentrism as the norm, the ideal of beauty standards, of educational standards, of political standards, societal standards, which deem European nations as first world countries, and nations that have predominantly people of color or of dark skin as quote unquote third world nations. Reading on in the second paragraph, belief in the superiority of one's own ethnic group may be a natural human tendency that advances the notion of dissimilarity between two ethnic groups. Each group tends to evaluate the other as to how similar or different the group is from its own. And the more similar people are, the greater they accept each other. The more dissimilar, the more negative stereotyping occurs, right? Which leads to hostilities and misunderstandings. Certainly, I think we can recognize as Americans the ethnocentrism of our own country, the centering of white European standards as the ideal standards, and others are marginalized. And you can see in this image, you see a white guy telling the black guy, go back to Africa, right? This is our country, whatever. Right? And then you see him talking to a Mexican guy, go back to Mexico. And then in the final little section, he's just kind of, stumped. Because what are you going to say to a Native American? You can't tell a Native American go back to their country because we are in Native American land and Native American territory, right? So, anyway, ethnocentrism is the belief that one particular ethnicity's culture, traditions, society, etc., is the ideal way to be. So, a prominent form of ethnocentrism is Eurocentrism, or the tendency to view others through the filters and assumptions of European primarily Northern European perspectives, and to assume European practices and perspectives to be the best, the ideal, the norm. And you don't have to be of European ancestry to be Eurocentric. There are plenty of people of color who adhere to this notion. A Eurocentric view considers history according to European experiences and paradigms. For example, the assumption that the history of the United States began with the arrival of Europeans. And a lot of us, it's not our fault necessarily if we believe these things, because this is what we were taught to believe, and this is what we were taught in our schools. Yeah. So there's a process of deprogramming that has to take place in order to train our brains to not think this way, and to begin to open our minds to accepting other ethnic and ethnicities, belief systems, ways of governing, ways of educating, ways of healing, on, as being important and as being as valuable as those of European culture. And as we can see in this picture, once again, we see, two Europeans slicing up the world for their own greed, to put on their own plates, right? Colonization is the process of assuming control, either by war, by conquer, by force, genocide, slavery, intimidation, etc., of someone else's territory, and applying one's own systems of law, government, and religion. And in terms of this course, we think of colonization by Spain, by Portugal, by other European nations over lands which were not theirs. I would love for you to consider this process by thinking about how would you feel if somebody showed up at your door tonight and told you to get out, or you and your family would be murdered, tortured, or forced out. Would you not fight back? Well, that's precisely what happened when Europeans came to this hemisphere of the earth and started claiming lands as their own. They had to contend with the people who lived there. And oftentimes, the people who lived in these lands were depicted as savages for fighting back to protect their land. But I ask you to consider, would you not do the same thing? Our first critical vocabulary term this week is maafa, a Kiswahili term that means disaster, calamity, or terrible occurrence. This term is used to describe the transatlantic slave trade in the Middle Passage. The European Holocaust against Africa, called the Ma'afa by some Pan Africanists, approximately claimed the lives of 48 million people, and it ranks as one of the greatest crimes in human history. And it is also one of the most lucrative, since its profits financed the creation of the European and Euro-American empire. So when we say Ma'afa, we mean the transatlantic slave trade, the great disaster, the great calamity. The Middle Passage refers to the brutal journey that Africans who were enslaved suffered over while they were kidnapped, stolen from their land, and transported across the Atlantic Ocean. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, Europeans stole, kidnapped, and moved more than 12 million Africans across the Atlantic Ocean as their human property. From 1560 to 1850, about 4.8 million Africans who were enslaved were taken to Brazil. 4.7 million were sent to the islands in the Caribbean, and at least 388,000, or 4% of those who survived the Middle Passage, came to North America. Between 1700 and 1808, which was the most active century of the international slave trade, Europeans transported around 40% of enslaved Africans in British and American ships. And as we will learn this week, the conditions within the Middle Passage were horrific. Sheer torture, murder, rape, disease, starvation that were faced by Africans who were enslaved as they began their perilous journey into slavery on the other side of the ocean. Imagine this: the Middle Passage, or the journey from Africa on ships to the Americas, lasted roughly 80 days on ships that could be small schooners or massive, purposely, intentionally built ships to hold slaves. Ship crews packed Africans together on or below the decks without space to sit up or even move around. As you can see in this image and many other images of the cross sections of slave ships, they were often forced to lie down, packed tightly as sardines, and could not even roll over or barely lift their heads, oftentimes on layers or levels of wooden planks to fit more people into the ships. Without ventilation, oxygen to breathe, or sufficient water or food, approximately 15% of Africans who were boarded on these ships grew sick and died. And there was no mercy. There were children, elders, pregnant women, and babies who all suffered the same fate. And on these ships, there was rampant abuse, whippings, mutilations, rape, and oftentimes Africans were forced or thrown overboard if they were deemed as people who were misbehaving or fighting back, or if they needed to lighten the load of the cargo. In addition to the physical violations enslaved Africans suffered, they were ripped away from their families, homelands, social positions, and languages. And oftentimes they were placed intentionally with people from other tribes who spoke different languages so that they could not unify and communicate with each other to fight back against the evil people who had enslaved them. Resistance is the refusal to accept or comply with something, the attempt to prevent something by action or argument, the act of fighting against something that is attacking you, or refusing to accept something. And in all ethnic studies courses, we highly emphasize the examples of resistance that people exhibited while being colonized, or while acts of inhumanity was carried out against them. These acts are often overlooked in history, but we specifically focus on the ways that people of color fought back against what was being done to them, so that we can truly see the power of these people and not just accept that they complied with the injustices that were being carried out against them, but that there were very real ways in which people have always fought back against injustice and cruelty and harm to their people, their lands, and to their families. An insurrection is an act or instance of open revolt against a civil authority or a constituted government, a rising up, a rebellion. Periodic acts of violent resistance on behalf of Africans who were enslaved during nearly 3 centuries of slavery as a way of fighting for their freedom. And it is important that we understand the countless acts of insurrection that took place, but that we are rarely taught about in history. Africans by no means just complicitly accepted their capture and their enslavement. And it is critical in ethnic studies that we focus on and explore their acts of insurrection.